The movie starts with a man named Clay, who was once part of a clandestine special forces group known as the Beekeepers. Mrs. Parker, a retired teacher, now dedicates her time to a charity that supports impoverished women and children. She appreciates Clay as a tenant because he is always polite and kind, and Clay, in turn, is grateful to Mrs. Parker for renting him the garage. One evening, after finishing his work, Mrs. Parker invites Clay to join her for dinner. While she is working on her laptop, a virus warning appears, claiming her hard drive is infected and instructing her to call a phone number to prevent data loss. Mrs. Parker promptly calls the number, unaware that it connects her to a gang of criminals posing as an antivirus company. As soon as she makes the call, the hackers seize control of her computer, gaining access to her financial transactions. Not being tech-savvy, Mrs. Parker seeks help from the supposed manager, Garnett. Confused by what is happening on her screen, Mrs. Parker listens as Garnett explains that it is part of their virus removal process and apologizes for the inconvenience. He then asks for her bank account information, promising compensation from their company. Without hesitation, Mrs. Parker provides her bank details to Garnett and is shocked to receive $50,000 as compensation. Later, Garnett informs her that he was authorized to send only $500 and requests that she return the excess amount. Without hesitation, Mrs. Parker goes online to initiate the transfer. However, as she enters her password to complete the transaction, she discovers that all her funds have vanished. Garnett and his team have hacked into her bank account, leaving Mrs. Parker devastated as she realizes she has lost not only her savings but also the funds meant for the charity she manages. Clay is occupied with harvesting honey and carefully placing it into a glass jar. He intends to present this honey as a gift to Mrs. Parker. However, upon arriving at her house, a sense of unease washes over him. Carefully, he retrieves a knife from the kitchen for protection. As he cautiously enters the living room, Clay is stunned to discover Mrs. Parker's lifeless body, with a pistol lying nearby on the floor. Next to her, at that moment, FBI agent Verona arrives, pointing her weapon at Clay. Verona suspects Clay's involvement in Mrs. Parker's death, complicating matters further as Mrs. Parker is her mother. Verona swiftly calls the local police, who promptly arrive to investigate Mrs. Parker's house and take Clay to the police station for questioning. Despite her profound grief over her mother's death, Verona remains resolute in uncovering the truth. She actively participates in the investigation, and during the examination of the crime scene, Verona uncovers evidence indicating that her mother had fallen victim to a criminal gang notorious for phishing scams. This gang had plundered all of Mrs. Parker's savings and the charity fund. To Verona's surprise, she manages to uncover evidence showing that her mother's death was not a murder, but rather a suicide. The police release Clay the next day. As Clay returns home, Verona arrives to apologize for wrongly accusing him of Mrs. Parker's death. She shares with him the details of her mother's passing and reveals how a criminal gang, posing as an antivirus company, deceived Mrs. Parker and looted her finances. Verona explains that this criminal group has eluded the FBI for years. Upon hearing this, Clay contacts the Beekeepers and requests their assistance in tracking down the gang responsible. He is determined to seek justice for Mrs. Parker. The Beekeepers promptly gather information about UDG, the fake antivirus company operated by Garnett. Soon after, Clay heads to UDG headquarters with 2 jerry cans of gasoline. Disabling the security guards, he confronts the employees in the control room. Clay subdues one of them and demands answers. They promise never to deceive people like Mrs. Parker again. Clay then instructs them to vacate the room and proceeds to douse all the computer equipment with gasoline. When Garnett and his cohorts arrive to confront Clay, he swiftly overpowers them. Clay sets up a bomb rigged to detonate upon receiving a phone call, warning Garnett to flee if he values his life. Moments later, a call triggers a massive explosion that devastates much of the UDG building. Garnett contacts his boss, Danforth, to report the incident. He details how a man known as the Beekeeper assaulted their company, disabled their security, and orchestrated an explosion that razed their headquarters. In response, Danforth commands Garnett to enlist some thugs and instructs them to eliminate Clay. Meanwhile, Verona, learning of the explosion at UDG headquarters, feels a sense of vindication. The following day, Garnett and his hired thugs track down Clay while he works on his bee farm. As Clay departed from the farm, Garnett and his men vandalized the beehives and clandestinely trailed him. Clay appeared aware of their pursuit and prepared for a confrontation. Upon reaching his home, Garnett and his gang ambushed Clay. He adeptly defended himself, engaging in a fierce battle that resulted in the demise of the thugs. Clay spared Garnett's life but imparted a harsh lesson by severing his fingers. Garnett narrowly escaped. Meanwhile, Verona was interrogating a UDG employee when news of a fire at her mother's residence reached her. She hurried to the scene and discovered that Clay's garage had been engulfed in flames. Amidst the wreckage, she found a UDG ID card near one of the bodies, leading her to suspect Clay's involvement with UDG. Meanwhile, after escaping Clay, Garnett contacted Danforth to report the failed assassination attempt and his loss of fingers. Angered, Danforth demanded answers about Clay's identity during their conversation. Suddenly, Clay reappeared and launched a surprise attack on Garnett. He bound Garnett to the front of a car and drove it into the water, effectively ending Garnett's life. Danforth overheard everything during the call. Clay then seized Garnett's phone and warned Danforth that he was coming for him. Meanwhile, Verona and her partner Matt searched government databases for information on Clay but came up empty-handed. Verona speculated that Clay might have received specialized training from a covert government unit, knowledge that even the FBI lacked. Verona discovered that Garnett, a senior figure in UDG, had been found drowned and tied to Clay's truck. Meanwhile, Danforth, under pressure for safety from his mother, President Jessica, arranged to meet with Wallace, a former CIA head now overseeing his security. Learning of Danforth's Beekeeper issue, Wallace promptly contacted Janet, the current CIA director, to inquire about Clay. Janet informed Wallace that Clay had retired from the Beekeepers. Wallace instructed Janet to eliminate Clay. Janet then reached out to the Beekeepers and assigned one of their operatives, Anna, the task of assassinating Clay. While Clay was at a gas station, Anna launched a surprise attack, but Clay managed to escape and defeated her. He incapacitated Anna by severing her fingers and initiated a fire that caused the gas station to explode, preventing further pursuit. The Beekeepers subsequently informed the CIA that they would remain neutral and cease pursuing Clay. Janet conveyed to Wallace that both the CIA and the Beekeepers had decided not to intervene further in the conflict between Clay and Danforth. Faced with this, Wallace decided to take matters into his own hands to eliminate Clay. He assembled a team of Special Forces operatives and briefed them about the Beekeepers, portraying Clay as a rogue agent posing a threat to innocent lives. Verona and Matt arrived at the charred gas station, discovered Anna's badly disfigured body. It appeared Anna belonged to a covert government unit, yet Verona remained uncertain about her motive for targeting Clay. Meanwhile, Clay utilized Anna's severed finger to infiltrate her residence and access her computer. Tracking the signal from Garnett's phone, Clay pinpointed Danforth's location at the 9 Points building. Armed with this critical information, Clay procured weapons and explosives from Anna's hideout and departed. Simultaneously, Wallace's special forces, charged with neutralizing Clay, had already arrived at the 9 Points building. Outside, the FBI SWAT team stood prepared, anticipating Clay's imminent assault on the premises. Surprisingly, Wallace and his team allowed the employees of UDG, including the NSU company involved in phishing scams, to continue their usual operations inside. Clay arrived soon after and caught the SWAT team off guard with his arrival, disrupting their carefully laid plans. He swiftly launched a surprise assault, swiftly overpowering the SWAT team. Once inside the building, Clay seamlessly blended in with the NSU employees. However, one of Wallace's Special Forces operatives recognized him and initiated an attack. Wallace's team joined in, but Clay deftly evaded their strikes, systematically defeating them until none remained. Afterward, Clay interrogated Rico, an NSU executive, pressing him to disclose the identity of the company's owner. Rico, visibly fearful, eventually divulged that the owner wielded considerable power and appeared immune to legal repercussions. Clay asserted confidently that no one was beyond his grasp, pledging to dismantle this powerful figure if it jeopardized innocent lives. Pressured and fearing for his safety, Rico reluctantly disclosed his boss's identity. Just then, Verona and her team arrived, weapons trained on Clay, but he eluded capture and escaped. Meanwhile, Verona and her partner uncovered that the owner of both NSU and UDG, implicated in phishing scams, was Danforth, the son of the United States President. These entities were part of Danforth Enterprise, a conglomerate owned by the Danforth family, managing software for various U.S. government agencies. Verona also grasped that Clay posed a potential threat not just to Danforth but also to President Jessica, who was Danforth's mother. Upon this realization, Deputy Director Pierre tasked Verona and Matt with capturing Clay. Simultaneously, the SWAT team bolstered security around the president and her family. The following day, Verona and her partner teamed up with Secret Service agents to safeguard President Jessica and her son during a charity event at their luxurious beachfront mansion. Despite the combined efforts of Secret Service and FBI agents, Wallace remained concerned about Danforth's safety. To mitigate this, he enlisted a group of mercenaries led by Lazarus, who boasted of previous encounters with individuals akin to Clay. Before losing a leg in a previous encounter, Lazarus claimed to have taken down a beekeeper. Meanwhile, Clay infiltrated the Danforth estate through a drainage channel, concealing himself beneath a truck. He incapacitated a SWAT team member, strategically planted bombs on vehicles, and disguised himself among guests attending the charity event. Meanwhile, Prigg briefed President Jessica on Danforth's utilization of Danforth Enterprises software in a phishing scam, enraging companies upon discovering their campaign funds were tainted by illicit activities. As tensions mounted, Verona realized Clay's presence and directed the SWAT team to apprehend him. Surrounded and at gunpoint, Clay feigned surrender, only to trigger explosions on the Secret Service vehicles, creating chaos and diversion. Clay swiftly dispatched those who had cornered him and made a determined dash into the mansion to locate Danforth. Inside, Jessica, now aware of her son's crimes, decided to confront Danforth, hoping for some form of leniency. Clay battled through the building, causing injuries among Secret Service agents and showing no mercy to Wallace's mercenaries. After overcoming various obstacles, Clay finally reached the hallway leading to the president's office and engaged in a fierce confrontation with Lazarus, emerging victorious. Clay pressed forward towards the president's office. Wallace attempted to intervene, pleading with Clay not to harm Danforth. Disregarding Wallace's pleas, Clay incapacitated him and pressed him into the office. In a desperate bid to prevent his mother from exposing his crimes, Danforth seized a pistol and fired in the chaos, hitting Prigg, seizing the opportunity. Panicking, Danforth took his own mother, Jessica, hostage. Verona attempted to reason with Clay, urging him not to harm Jessica or her son. In the tense standoff, Danforth, nervous and desperate, contemplated using his mother as leverage to escape. In this critical moment, Clay confronted Verona, questioning whether she sought mere law enforcement or true justice. Witnessing Danforth's threat to his mother, Clay made a definitive choice. He shot and killed Danforth, then escaped through a window. Verona had a clear shot at Clay but let him go, choosing justice for her mother and other victims over strict law enforcement. The film ended with Clay fleeing the mansion using scuba gear hidden on the beach to escape. So the moral of the story is, if you mess with beekeepers, you might just get stung, and maybe think twice before inviting a secret agent turned beekeeper to dinner.